The call came from a woman named Meredith, and she spoke the way people do when they've been holding something heavy for a long time, carefully, like she didn't want to spill it. She said her mother's house had a study that hadn't been properly touched in 12 years. Her father's things. She wanted it restored, not gutted, some pieces cleaned, a few repaired, the woodwork refinished where time had gotten to it. She'd found my name through a furniture dealer in Millhaven who'd sold a secretary desk I'd restored the previous spring. She said the dealer told her I was patient. She said it like that was the most important thing. I told her I could come Thursday. She paused, and then she said, almost as an aside, there's one piece my mother won't let anyone touch. A chair. You'll see it when you get there. Please don't, just leave it alone. I said I would. I wrote down the address, hung up the phone, and stood in my workshop for a moment with my hand still on the receiver. May was at the kitchen table doing homework, and she called out to ask who it was. I told her it was a job. She went back to her spelling words. She was 9 years old and took most things at face value, which I'd always found was the right way to take them. I drove out Thursday morning, an hour east of town. The house sat at the end of a gravel drive, a 2-story colonial with a deep front porch and old oak trees that had been growing longer than the house had been standing. Meredith met me at the door. She was somewhere in her early 40s, dressed like she'd come straight from an office, pressed blouse, hair neat, but her eyes were tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. She shook my hand and thanked me for coming and walked me through the house quickly, pointing out a sideboard with a warped panel, a bookcase whose joints had loosened, a writing desk with a stuck drawer. Then she opened the study door. It was a quiet room. North-facing, so the light came in soft and even across the floor. There was a large desk, dark walnut, papers still on it the way they'd been left. Shelves on 2 walls. And in the corner, beside the window, a high-backed oak chair with a woven rush seat and turned legs. I stopped in the doorway. Meredith said something. I didn't hear it right away. I was looking at the chair. I knew that chair. I had built that chair. Not one like it. That one. I recognized the curve of the crest rail, the particular taper I put on the back posts, the way the stretcher sat lower than standard because the man who'd commissioned it was tall and preferred the lower brace. I'd spent 11 days on that chair in the spring of 2011. White oak, hand-planed, traditional mortise and tenon throughout. The man's name had been James. James Ward. He'd come into my shop on a Wednesday, driven 90 minutes from this address to find me specifically because a friend had told him I was the only person still doing the joinery by hand. He'd been particular about every detail. He'd known exactly what he wanted. He'd stood in my shop with his hands in his jacket pockets and pointed at things and said, that angle, just like that, and a little more height on the back, and I'd written it all down in the small notebook I kept for commissions. When I found the notebook afterward, months later, I'd seen his name on the page and felt something quiet move through me that I didn't have the right word for then and still don't entirely. Mr. Calder. I looked at Meredith. Sorry, I said. This is beautiful work in here. She nodded. My father's desk. He had it for 30 years. The chair, she glanced at the corner, my mother sits there every morning. She has since he died. She talks to the other chair. She said it simply, the way you say the true things when you've gotten past pretending they aren't true. Please just work around it. Of course, I said. She showed me out and said her mother would be home by 10. She left me a key and drove back to wherever she worked, and I stood in that study with the morning light coming through the window and my hand on the doorframe, and I thought about James Ward and what he had asked me to do. He'd asked me to do 2 things. The first was to build the chair. The second was something I hadn't thought about in years, because I'd done it and kept it and assumed the right time would come on its own. I heard the front door open at 10 past 10. Helen Ward was a small woman, maybe 70, with white hair and a straight back and hands that moved like she was used to doing things with them. She came into the study without seeing me at first. I was at the bookcase, working a loose joint with a clamp, and she went straight to the chair, the one she always sat in, the one across from the empty one. She settled into it, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at the high-backed oak chair in the corner. She didn't say anything. She just looked at it. Then she noticed me, and she straightened slightly, not startled, just recalibrating. You must be the restorer. Roy Calder, I said. I'm sorry to intrude. You're not intruding, she said. Meredith hired you. You're supposed to be here. She looked back at the chair. I told her not to let anyone touch that one. I won't, I said. She studied me for a moment. Do you want some coffee, Roy Calder? I said I did, and she went to make it, and that was how we began. I came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. The work in the study was slow. I was being careful with the desk, and there was a section of the bookcase trim that had to be stripped and restained to match. I'd lost my wife 4 years back, and I had gotten careful about most things since then, not just wood. Slow was how I knew to do it. Helen was there each morning. She'd bring 2 cups of coffee without asking and set one on the corner of the desk near where I was working. She never asked if I wanted it. She just brought it, the way people do when they've lived long enough to understand that small gestures don't need to be negotiated. Most mornings she sat in her chair and read. Sometimes she talked to the empty one. Quietly, under her breath. I didn't strain to hear it. It wasn't meant for me. On the 3rd Tuesday, May had a half day at school, and I brought her with me because there was no one else. She came in, looked around the study with the serious expression she gets when she's taking inventory of a room, and then walked over and sat on the footstool near Helen's chair without being asked. Helen looked at her for a moment, and May looked back at her. That's a good chair, May said, nodding toward the oak one in the corner. It is, Helen said. My husband's. May considered this. My mom's chair is still at our house too, she said. Dad sits next to it sometimes. Helen glanced at me. I kept my eyes on the trim I was sanding. After a moment, Helen said, How long? 4 years, May said. Helen nodded, like that was an answer she understood the weight of exactly. They sat together quietly after that, and I worked, and the study was the most peaceful room I'd been in for a long time. Helen started talking to me on the 4th Tuesday. Not about James specifically at first, about the house, about the oak trees outside, about how she'd planted the garden on the east side the year they moved in and it had gotten away from her since. Then, one morning, she talked about him. She talked about how he used to sit in the chair by the window every morning with his coffee and read the paper, and how she'd sit across from him in hers and pretend to read her book but mostly watch him, because she'd always liked looking at him. How he'd been gone 12 years and she still woke up every morning expecting to find him there. How talking to the chair was the only thing that made the mornings make sense. I listened. I didn't fill the silence with anything that didn't need to be there. On the 6th Tuesday, I finished the bookcase. The desk was done. The last thing left in the study was the chair. I sat with that for a day. Then I called Meredith. I told her there was one more thing I needed to do before I could close out the job, and that it might take an hour, and could she be there? She said she could come Saturday morning. I came early. Helen was in the study, in her chair, coffee in hand. I set my bag down and I said, Mrs. Ward, I need to tell you something, and I hope you'll let me finish before you say anything. She looked at me over the rim of her cup. All right. I built that chair, I said. In 2011. Your husband drove out to my shop in Millhaven and commissioned it. We spent about 3 hours together that first day, going over every detail. He was particular. He knew what he wanted. Helen lowered her cup slowly. She was looking at the chair, not at me. Her face had gone very still. He came back one more time, I said. About 2 weeks before he died. I didn't know it was that close, he didn't say. He asked me to do one more thing to the chair. He asked me to carve something into the underside of the seat. He dictated it to me, letter by letter, because he said his handwriting had gotten too unsteady. He said, I stopped, cleared my throat. He said to keep it there until whoever needed it was ready to find it. Helen set her cup on the side table. She stood up. She walked to the chair in the corner and stood in front of it for a long moment, and then she looked at me. Will you show me, she said. I lifted the chair carefully and turned it over in my hands. On the underside of the rush seat, in the flat oak rail where the seat meets the back, there were letters carved in a clean, even hand, mine, but his words, shaped from what he'd given me in that quiet afternoon in my shop while sawdust drifted in the light and he sat on a stool and spoke slowly and carefully, like a man who understood he was spending something he wouldn't get back. I read it to her. He'd written, "You were the best thing that was ever mine. Don't talk to the chair. Go outside. The garden needs you and so does Meredith. I'll find you there." Helen stood with her hand over her mouth. Then she laughed, a short, wet sound, halfway between a cry and something lighter. She shook her head slowly. 12 years, she said. He's been bossing me around for 12 years and I didn't even know it. Meredith had come in while I was reading. I hadn't heard her. She was standing in the doorway with her hand on the frame, and her face had the look of someone who has been afraid for a long time and has just been told they can stop. I set the chair down gently, right side up, in its corner by the window. Helen looked at it for a long moment. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the garden, at the east side of the house, where the beds had gone loose and wild and needed someone to pay attention to them. She put her hand on the glass. "It does need me," she said quietly. Not to the chair. To herself. May was waiting on the front porch when I came out. She'd brought a book but hadn't opened it. She looked up at me the way she does when she already knows the answer but wants to hear it from me anyway. "Did it go okay?" she asked. I sat down beside her on the porch steps and looked out at the oak trees and the long gravel drive and the morning light coming through the leaves. "Yeah," I said. "It went okay." She leaned her head against my arm for a second, the way she does when she's not making a big thing of something but still wants to be close. And we sat there in the quiet for a few minutes before I told her it was time to go, and she gathered her book, and we walked together to the truck. Behind us, through the side window of the house, I could see Helen Ward in the garden, moving slowly between the beds with her hands in the soil, talking, not to a chair, not to a room, but to the open air in the morning and whatever she believed was listening. James had known she'd get there. He just needed someone to hold the words until she was ready. I was glad he'd trusted me to do it.